Well, good afternoon, everybody. Kalispera. We have a very dedicated audience of a small number, but I know we're also speaking to people online. We have a very distinguished topic and pair of panelists today because we're talking about the changes in European economic governance. Now, to introduce the panelists first, we have Joaquin Almunia, former European Commissioner, two different mandates, one on competition policy and one on economic and financial affairs. And at one stage, working for him, with Marco Buti, now a professor at the European University Institute in Florence. Joaquin is now at the Sciences Po in Paris. Marco was the Director General for the same Directorate General, as well as having many different jobs, eventually become the chef de cabinet to Paolo Gentiloni, the current commissioner. Our panel is going to discuss the reforms of economic governance which took place and were culminated in an agreement last December. And the question then is why? There are several reasons. One is that the existing rules and framework had become increasingly unsatisfactory. They were not able to deal with some of the problems that arose. They were what we call, as economists, pro-cyclical. They are supporting the economic cycle, which made things worse for a country like Greece. They were very, very complicated. There's a story that only two people in the European Commission understood them, and a maximum of one could be on any particular aeroplane. And there are many other problems that made the whole system unwieldy and unsuccessful. And that's what the reforms are intended to introduce. I'm going to alternate questions to the speakers, but I want first to ask Joaquin to give his opinion on what was wrong with the old system and whether the sort of things I'm highlighting are accurate. Joaquin.
Thank you very much, Iain.
You have to
everybody. Yes? No. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Iain. And good afternoon to everybody. So the original framework started in 1997, if I remember well, was obviously too rigid. There was no previous experience. The euro was being created. In fact, was created 2 years after the original Stability and Growth Pact was agreed, and was too rigid, up to the point that the first infringers of the rules were Germany and France, supported by some other countries, but the two most important countries, members of the euro, inventors of the euro, were the first infringers. In my period, I started as Commissioner for Economic Affairs in 2004. So 1 year after the first big infringement of the rules, the pact was slightly revised under my initiative, making it slightly more flexible, but still too rigid. But in 2010 started the austerity years after the big crisis here in Greece and transmitted to other members of the euro area. And these austerity years brought an even more rigid framework, the six-pack and two-pack. During the last years of the last years of Barroso Commission and the first period of the Juncker Commission, the rules were the same, were still very strict, but the enforcement of the rules changed in a softer way. So there were flexible enforcement of a very rigid framework. At the end came the pandemic and the Stability and Growth Pact. The framework was suspended because of the big recession triggered by the pandemic. And now we are waiting for the entry into force of the new fiscal framework. We will have some comments afterwards. But in fact, my balance of the original framework, the 1997 framework, with these changes on the way, I think there are some real mistakes, both in the design and the framework, but also some successes. So my balance is not fully negative, neither fully positive. It's a balance of a very strange framework, very difficult to be enforced in any case.
Thank you, Joaquin. I'm going to turn immediately now to Marco, who will tell us some of the key features of the new system that was agreed by the European Council, or the Council of Economic and Finance Ministers in December. Marco.
Thank you very much, Iain. Yes, I think you and Joaquin outlined a bit the shortcomings of the previous set of rules. So the proposal of the Commission initially put forward in a communication in November 2022 and then April 2023 formally wanted to correct 5 shortcomings of the initial rules. Very high debt, so how to tackle the very high debt, and here we introduced an assessment of the debt sustainability to debt sustainability analysis, so giving stronger roots to the assessment of the sustainability threats. Second point, it was limited incentives for reform and investment to boost growth and sustainable growth, and there what is foreseen is that the possibility of lengthening the adjustment period embodied in national, it's called fiscal structural rules, from 4 to 7 years, if a country implements the right reform or investment. Third point is to tackle the procyclical bias. Here, the way of doing it has been to focus on net expenditure, which has better properties from the stabilization standpoint than the structural deficit. Fourth, the complexity issue. So we moved from a plethora of indicators to only one, what I just mentioned, the net expenditure rules, so increasing simplicity. And finally, the issue of lack of ownership and law enforcement. I think Joaquin mentioned that, and here the idea has been to empower the member state to put forward programs themselves, so embodying a medium-term perspective, so a more country-specific element, which should improve ownership and therefore compliance, and would give legitimacy to the enforcement. Okay, I give you my assessment in numbers on these 5 issues. Very high debt. I think if I compare the initial proposal of the Commission and the Council eventual agreement, and also in the trilogue with the Parliament, I think very high debt. Out of 1 to 5, I would give 4. I think I would give 4 also to reforms for investment reforms. I would give 3 to the tackling procyclical bias. I would get 1 only for the complexity, because in the negotiations a lot of safeguard elements have been included, and I think making the rules as complex as before at the end of the day. And finally, on lack of ownership law enforcement, here is a question mark. We'll have to see. I think basically the current Commission has announced that it would open excessive deficit procedures for a number of countries, those on an unsustainable path and a deficit higher than 3%, and we'll have to see whether this happens really and what will be the adjustment path that is recommended by the Commission and adopted by the Council. So, question mark on the final 5th point.
Thank you, Mark. You've done the impossible in explaining that in so few minutes. There's one other thing I think is worth adding, which is that the Commission is trying to reinforce the role of national fiscal councils like IRF in Spain, or the Ufficio Parlamentario in Italy, in enforcing the rules and helping with that. But with that addition, Joaquin, let me turn to you and say, what do you think? Has it solved the problems? You used to be the Commissioner in charge. You had to enforce these rules. Is it enforceable now?
Well, looking at the original proposal from the Commission in 2022 that finally was corrected before the formal proposal went to the Council and the Parliament because of the pressures on the Commission by some member states. I think there is a big hole in the proposal is the absence of a central fiscal capacity. I think without a central fiscal capacity to avoid procyclicality and to reinforce the role of the enforcer, and in particular the role of the Commission, is very difficult. There are risks of austerity, coming back to austerity, even if the original proposal tries to avoid this, because of the room for investments that will be badly needed in the next years because of the energy transition, because of the need to finance defense and security at the European level, because of the digital transition, the lack of competitiveness. This, in my view, the room for maneuver for investments is clearly reduced if you compare the reality of the new rules with the ambitions at the origin of the debate. I think there are reputational risks for the Commission that will not be avoided because of the very low influence of the national fiscal authorities. At the end, some elements introduced by the Council as the corrections of the original model of the Commission make much more difficult to strengthen the influence of national fiscal authorities that knows much better than the ministers in the Council of the other countries, or even much better than the officials in the Commission, what are the real needs, the real problems, and the real incentives that can give way to a clear improvement of the sustainability of the debt in the member states, and clear, much better knowledge of the clear incentives to push in favor of investments at the national level and to promote structural reforms that will be needed if we want more sustainable economies and a more sustainable economic and monetary union at large. So I think on the way till the final adoption of the fiscal framework, the new fiscal framework, the original proposals has been corrected in the worst direction.
Always the way. It's called the lowest common denominator. At this point, what I'm going to do is ask some quick-fire questions to the panelists alternately on particular topics. Let me start with you, Marco. Although they are no longer economically sensible, the new proposal, the new framework, continues to refer to the 3% deficit and the 60% debt. Does this make sense?
Look, it doesn't very much, but if you ask me, you have a limited amount of political capital. Would you use it to change the treaty, to change the 3% and 60%? My answer would be no. I think I would put the political capital in what exactly Joaquin said before, which is forming a central fiscal capacity, and we have the opportunity after next generation EU to do so with the multi-annual financial framework in 2027. Also because with the new set of rules, we go more and more on the 3% and on the 60%. We transform that from very rigid threshold to signaling indicators of what to do. So when a country goes above 3%, or we judge the path of reduction of the debt, is to check whether countries is doing the right thing or not, whether the deviations are due to external shocks, circumstances not under the control of the government, etc. So I think this is the right way of doing it. It's a signaling indicator more than a very rigid threshold.
Right, so it softens it, but the benchmarks are still going to be in use with some sorts of advantages. Joaquin, let me turn to you. I mentioned before that you had been responsible for enforcement. If you were now in that seat again trying to enforce, would you be optimistic about your ability to enforce, or would you be pessimistic?
Well, if I look at the new fiscal framework, at the new fiscal rules, as I said before, would be now more difficult because of these additional requirements introduced by the Council on the speed to reduce the deficits or to the speed to reduce the public debt ratio into GDP. I think it was much better to trust the opinions of the national fiscal authorities, the deep analysis of what is the real situation of every national economy, what are the possibilities, what are the unintended consequences of accelerating the reduction of the public debt or to improve the public debt sustainability. I think this requires qualitative criteria much more than the numerical indicators that had been introduced outside what was the original framework as designed by the Commission. In any case, to complement with my opinion what Marco said on the 3% and the 60% reference values, I think it's a pragmatic decision not to move these figures. This will require unanimity, will be extremely difficult, this will trigger a lot of discussions, and maybe if some tough finance ministers or head of state and government will prevail in the debate, the figures will be even worse. So I prefer not to take into consideration what is the real level of those figures that are there since the Maastricht Treaty, and to take into account a more intelligent enforcement of the fiscal framework. How it will be, we will have new commissioners and new president of the Commission in the autumn this year. So at the same time that the present Commission in the last couple of months will decide to open excessive deficit procedures and so on, but the present Commission, the present Commissioner and the present team of Ursula von der Leyen will not enforce these rules. And the personality, the criteria and the orientation of the next commissioners, and in particular the next economic commissioner, the orientation of the whole College of Commissioners, and the composition of the next ECOFIN that will move depending on the results of the national elections in different countries will answer your question much better than me. I don't know if the next European authorities will be good enforcers or bad enforcers of those rules.
That sounds like the good Italian word, vediamo, we shall see.
Vediamo.
One of the elements of the new approach is to emphasize, and this is a very strange word, ownership at the national level. Marco, do you think ownership at the national level will improve in a way that means that Italy, Greece, or even Germany take more responsibility?
Okay, in my initial grading, lack of ownership and law enforcement, I think I gave a 3 out of 5 on the new proposal. So I think let's wait and see will occur to that as well. But I really hope that we can improve that, because at the end of the day, and it is for the application of the fiscal rules, it is for the implementation of the macroeconomic imbalances procedure, the other set of rules for macroeconomic surveillance. If there is no ownership, there is no political legitimacy, and it is very difficult also both to ensure compliance and to have strong enforcement. I mean, so the whole idea of the proposal of the Commission, I think largely retained by the Council with with some deterioration, as Joaquin said, because I mean the implementation, little numerology added to that. But I think the overall it has been retained. So it is very important that there is ownership, which is the precondition for enforcement. And I have to say, I think we need to understand the link between ownership, enforcement, and the development of the set of let's say, economic governance that we have. Because it's only if you have a proper enforcement that then you can create the necessary, definitely not sufficient, but necessary conditions to start a good discussion on the central fiscal capacity. If we do not have that, it's not going to happen at the central level either.
Another question for you, Joaquin, which I didn't give you in advance, so you have to think on your feet, is one thing that would seem to be rejected in the new approach was the idea of a golden rule, which protects investment, maybe extending that to green investments. Do you think that was a mistake to reject it?
Not exactly the golden rule. I think the golden rule is more an accounting principle than an economic policy principle. Because what is important is to make room for maneuver in the national public finances and in the whole framework for the fiscal space at the euro area level to allow investments, not to make a contradiction, to intensify investments that are badly needed at the national level and at the global European level, and make this a contradiction with a good development of the fiscal rules towards fiscal sustainability and towards a good mix between fiscal policy and monetary policy. I think the golden rule as a principle to encourage investments, I fully agree, but the golden rule as an accounting principle to hide the increase on debt levels because you are investing more, I think is not a good rule for a good enforcement of the fiscal framework. But of course, we need to increase investments, both with common EU funding, Next Generation 2.0, or another kind of financial flows to encourage investments at the EU level, and at the same time for Spanish or Greek or Italian or not British, good economic policy at the national level.
We're running out of time. Right, I'm going to give my two speakers 1 minute each to have concluding remarks, including maybe the question of what does it all mean for Greece? Marco first.
Okay, first of all, I mean, we had, take Greece in particular. I mean, if you take a snapshot 10 years ago, you take a snapshot now, you compare the two, who would have said that he would travel that journey there? And I have to say that both for the implementation of the fiscal rules, but also on the implementation of the national program and the Next Generation EU, Greece is an example for other countries. And actually, the fact that it was so tough at the time in terms of implementation of reforms and the steep learning curve that we had on working between the Union, the Commission, and the government, I think is paying off now. And I think we can look with confidence to the future.
Okay. No, I have a very optimistic view on the present evolution of the Greek economy if we compare what was the situation not only in 2010, but before 2010 and after the end of the programs in the last years. I think the improvement has been evident, should continue. The EU should take care that this positive evolution can continue, and for this reason, I fear that the bad enforcement of the new fiscal framework can put obstacles in this good way that Greece is following in the last 10 years.
Right, I'm going to steal the last 15 seconds to say that There are a lot of uncertainties and unknowns about this new framework, whether it will succeed in overcoming the past problems. The only answer I can give to this at this point is let's wait and see and try to be optimistic that it will do better than the last days of the previous framework. I don't know if anybody in the audience wants to raise a hand saying yes it will or no it won't, but there's too few to take a proper vote. So with that we have to end, so please join me in thanking these two excellent panelists for their succinct presentations. Thank you.